Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples in life. In a world where most people walk past those in need, one man's simple gesture of compassion would change everything. In the dusty frontier town of Copper Ridge, a rugged mountain man named Silas Crane sees an elderly stranger stuck in a broken wheelchair. While others pass by without a second glance, Silas kneels down and fixes it with his bare hands and a few spare parts. He asks for nothing and walks away before the old man can thank him. What Silas doesn't know is that he just helped Jonas Whitmore, the wealthiest man in 3 territories. What happens next will surprise you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Copper Ridge wasn't much to look at anymore. Time had worn the town down the way wind wears down a mountainside, steady and patient and without mercy. The buildings along Main Street leaned slightly, their paint peeling in long strips that curled like wood shavings. The boardwalks creaked under even the lightest footstep, and gaps between the planks showed the dust-packed earth below. Once this town had been something. The copper mines had promised wealth and brought hope. Families had come from back east with dreams bigger than the Montana sky. But the copper ran out, as all things do, and the dreams ran out with it. What remained was a stubborn collection of souls who had nowhere else to go, or nothing else to return to. Maybe 300 people called Copper Ridge home now, down from near 2,000 in the glory days. The bank building stood empty, its windows like dead eyes staring at nothing. The hotel still operated, but barely, with only the occasional traveling salesman or lost surveyor needing a bed. The general store, the saloon, the church, the sheriff's office, these were the bones of the town. And they held together because the people needed them to. The mountains rose up behind Copper Ridge like the walls of a fortress. Pine-covered slopes climbing toward peaks that held snow even in summer. Those mountains had been there long before the town and would be there long after the last building collapsed into dust. They were patient that way. Between the town and the high country lay miles of foothills, creased with valleys and threaded with streams that ran cold and clear. This was where Silas Crane made his home. Silas was 45 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the grey in his beard might have suggested older. The mountains aged a man differently than town life did. His hands were scarred and weathered, the kind of hands that knew the weight of an axe and the sting of winter cold. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and strong, in the way men get when they work hard every day and eat only what they need. His hair was dark brown, shot through with silver, worn long enough to tie back when he was working. His eyes were grey-blue, the color of a winter sky, and they carried a sadness that never quite left, even when he smiled. He hadn't always lived alone in the high country. 5 years ago, he'd had a wife, Sarah. Her name still caught in his throat sometimes when he thought it. She'd been small and quick, with auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, and a laugh that could fill a room. She'd made their small cabin feel like a palace. She'd tended a garden that somehow thrived in the short growing season, and she'd had a way with people that Silas had never possessed. Where he was quiet and reserved, she'd been warm and open. She'd balanced him, completed him in ways he hadn't understood until she was gone. The fever had taken her in late autumn. One week she'd been fine, working on her winter preserves and humming while she worked. The next week she was sick. The week after that she was gone. Silas had buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley, where she could see the sunrise. He'd marked the grave with a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself, and he'd planted wildflower seeds all around it. Every spring they bloomed, purple and yellow and white, and every spring he visited to pull the weeds and sit for a while in silence. After Sarah died, Silas had pulled away from town. He'd stopped coming down, except when he absolutely needed supplies. He'd stopped talking to people beyond what was necessary for trade. He'd buried himself in work, in the rhythms of trapping and hunting, in the endless tasks that kept a man alive in the wilderness. The isolation had been a kind of medicine at first, a numbing agent that kept the grief at bay. But over time, it had become something else. It had become a prison of his own making, one he no longer knew how to escape. He still came to town once a month, always on the second Tuesday. He'd ride down from the mountains on his buckskin mare, a patient horse named Dancer, who knew the trail as well as he did. He'd tie up outside the general store, conduct his business, maybe exchange a few words with Sheriff Tom Brennan if their paths crossed, and then he'd ride back up into the high country before sunset. That was the pattern, and patterns were safe. Patterns didn't require feeling anything. The general store was run by Martha Hayes, a widow herself, somewhere in her 60s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd known Sarah, had been fond of her, and she'd watched Silas retreat into himself after the funeral. She never pushed, never pried, but she always had a kind word ready when he came in. She'd set aside things she thought he might need, coffee beans, flour, salt, tobacco, and she never charged him quite what the items were worth, though she pretended she did. Silas knew. But he also knew better than to argue with Martha Hayes. Sheriff Tom Brennan was cut from different cloth than most lawmen. He was in his 50s, built solid and square, with a face that had seen enough trouble to know when to step in and when to let things be. He'd served in the war, on the Union side, and he'd come west afterward like so many veterans had, looking for something he probably couldn't name. He'd been sheriff of Copper Ridge for 20 years, and he ran the town with a fair hand and a firm voice. He respected Silas because Silas never caused trouble and always kept his word. The two men weren't exactly friends, but there was an understanding between them, the kind that didn't require many words. Copper Ridge had its share of other characters, people whose lives intersected in the small ways that small-town lives do. There was Frank Cooper, who ran the saloon and watered down his whiskey just enough that you noticed but not enough to complain about. There was Reverend Samuel Price, who preached to a congregation that had shrunk to maybe 20 souls on a good Sunday. There was Doc Harrison, who was 70 if he was a day, and whose hands shook just enough to make you nervous if he had to stitch you up. And there were the families, the farmers and ranchers and workers who scratched out livings from the unforgiving land. And then there were the Whitmores. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew about the Whitmores, though few had ever actually met them. Jonas Whitmore owned most of the land for 20 miles in any direction. His ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, with thousands of acres of grazing land, timber rights in the mountains, and water rights that made him king of everything. He'd come to Montana 40 years ago, so the story went, and he'd struck it rich. Some said gold, some said silver, some said copper. Whatever the truth, Jonas Whitmore had turned his fortune into an empire. He'd bought up failing ranches, consolidated them, built a cattle operation that stretched clear to the territorial borders. But wealth and land hadn't brought him happiness, or so people said. His wife had passed away years ago, and his children had moved back east, wanting nothing to do with frontier life. Jonas lived alone in his great house, looked after by a small staff, managing his holdings through foremen and lawyers. He rarely came to town anymore. When he did, people noticed. He was a figure of mystery and speculation, someone who existed more as an idea than a person. That morning in early September, Silas had ridden into Copper Ridge just like he always did. The air had been crisp with the promise of autumn, and the aspens on the mountainsides were just starting to turn gold. He'd tied Dancer to the hitching post outside Martha's store and had gone inside to collect his supplies. Martha had greeted him with her usual warmth, asking after his health and commenting on the weather. He'd nodded, answered briefly, and had loaded his saddlebags with the things he needed. He was walking back to his horse, his mind already on the ride home, when he saw the wheelchair. It sat in the middle of the dusty street, canted at an angle, one wheel clearly broken. In the chair sat an old man, thin and frail, his face lined with age and frustration. He was dressed in clothes that had once been fine, but were now dusty from the street. His hands gripped the armrests, and he was looking around as if hoping someone might help him. People walked past. Not many, because Copper Ridge wasn't a busy place, but enough. A woman with a basket hurried by, her eyes down. A man leading a mule cart gave the wheelchair a wide berth. No one stopped. No one seemed to see, or if they saw, they chose not to. Silas stopped. He didn't think about it, didn't weigh the decision. He just stopped, the way a man stops when he sees something that needs fixing. He crossed the street and knelt down beside the wheelchair, setting his saddlebags in the dust. "Let me take a look at that for you," he said quietly. The old man turned to him, surprise and relief flickering across his weathered face. "I'd be grateful. The thing just gave out on me." Silas examined the wheel. The axle had sheared, likely from hitting one of the deep ruts that scarred the street. It was a clean break, but it had left the chair immobile. He had tools in his saddlebag. He always carried basic tools, and he had some spare metal stock he'd brought down to trade. Within a few minutes, he'd fashioned a temporary repair, binding the axle with wire and a metal sleeve he'd cut from a piece of scrap. It wouldn't last forever, but it would get the old man where he needed to go. "That should hold," Silas said, standing up and brushing the dust from his knees. "But you'll want to get a proper repair done when you can." The old man nodded, his eyes studying Silas with an intensity that seemed odd. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Silas said. "Just happened to have the right piece on me. Glad I could help." "At least tell me your name," the old man said. "Silas Crane," he replied. Then he picked up his saddlebags, nodded once, and walked back to his horse. He mounted up and rode out of town without looking back, the way he always did. He didn't know that the old man in the wheelchair was Jonas Whitmore. He didn't know that people had stopped in doorways to watch, or that Martha Hayes had witnessed the whole thing from her store window. He didn't know that Sheriff Brennan had been standing on the boardwalk outside his office, taking it all in with those careful eyes of his. Silas didn't know any of that, because he hadn't been looking for recognition or thanks. He'd just seen something broken and had fixed it, the way his father had taught him to do. His father, Jacob Crane, had been a man of few words but strong principles. He'd taught Silas that you help people when you can, that you do what's right because it's right, not because there's something in it for you. Jacob had died when Silas was 20, caught in a late spring avalanche while checking his trap lines. Silas had found his body 3 days later, half buried in snow. He'd carried his father down the mountain and buried him next to his mother, and he'd tried to live the way Jacob had taught him to live. The ride back up to the cabin took 2 hours. Silas followed the trail through pine forests and across meadows where deer grazed in the late morning light. He crossed a stream on a log bridge he'd built himself years ago, solid and sturdy, built to last. The higher he climbed, the more the weight of the town fell away. Up here things made sense. Trees grew or fell, animals lived or died. Seasons turned. There was a simplicity to it, a clarity that town life lacked. His cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pines. It was a modest structure. One room with a sleeping loft, built from logs he'd cut and notched himself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a small window looked out toward the valley. Outside, there was a shed for tools and storage, a small stable for Dancer, and a smokehouse for preserving meat. A garden plot, now mostly gone to seed with summer's end, showed where Sarah had once grown vegetables. Silas still tended it, though not with her skill or devotion. It was enough to keep her memory alive. He unsaddled Dancer and turned her into the small corral, then carried his supplies inside. The cabin was clean but spare, everything in its place. Sarah's recipe book still sat on a shelf near the fireplace, its pages worn from use. He'd tried to cook from it a few times after she died, but it had hurt too much to see her handwriting, to remember her voice reading the instructions aloud while she worked. Now it just sat there, a relic of a life that felt impossibly far away. That evening, as the sun set and turned the sky orange and purple, Silas sat on the porch and smoked his pipe. He thought about the old man in the wheelchair, wondered briefly if the repair would hold, then let the thought drift away like smoke. He didn't know that 3 days from now his life would change. He didn't know that the simple act of kindness he'd performed without thinking would set in motion events that would pull him back into the world he'd left behind. All he knew was the quiet of the mountains, the weight of his solitude, and the ache that never quite went away. He finished his pipe, knocked out the ashes, and went inside to sleep. 3 days passed in the mountains the way they always did, marked by the rising and setting of the sun and little else. Silas checked his trap lines, repaired a section of fence around his corral, and cut wood for the coming winter. The work was steady and familiar, the kind that occupied his hands while his mind wandered where it would. He thought about Sarah less frequently now than he had in the first years, but she was still there, a presence in the corners of his consciousness, like sunlight through trees. On the 4th day, he heard horses coming up the trail. Silas rarely had visitors. The cabin was remote enough that most people had no reason to make the climb, and those who might have reason generally didn't know where to find him. He set down the axe he'd been sharpening and walked to the edge of the clearing, his hand resting instinctively on the hunting knife at his belt. Old habits from younger days, when the mountains had been less settled and more dangerous. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. The first was a man Silas recognized, Buck Henley, foreman of the Whitmore ranch. He was in his 40s, weathered and capable, the kind of man who knew cattle and horses and how to manage both. The second rider was younger, likely one of the ranch hands. They both pulled up when they saw Silas, and Buck raised a hand in greeting. Silas Crane. Buck called out. "That's right," Silas replied, walking forward. "What brings you up here, Buck?" Buck dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "Got a message for you." "From Mr. Whitmore himself," Silas frowned. "Don't know any Whitmore? You fixed his wheelchair 3 days ago in town," Buck said, pulling a folded paper from his vest pocket. "He wants to thank you proper and offer a reward for your trouble." Understanding dawned slowly. The old man in the wheelchair had been Jonas Whitmore. Silas had heard the name often enough, knew the reputation, but he'd never connected the frail figure in the dusty street with the wealthy rancher who owned half the territory. "Wasn't any trouble," Silas said. "Just a quick repair. Nothing that needs rewarding." Buck held out the paper. "Mr. Whitmore figured you might say that. Asked me to give you this, and to tell you he'd consider it a personal favor if you'd come see him." Silas took the paper but didn't open it. "He doing all right? The wheelchair holding up?" "Better than all right," Buck said with a slight smile. "He's been talking about you ever since. Says it's been a long time since someone helped him without wanting something in return." He paused, studying Silas with frank curiosity. "Truth is, Mr. Whitmore's not been well. Doctor says his heart's wearing out. He doesn't get around much anymore. And when that chair broke down on him in town, he thought he was stuck there for hours. You helping him meant more than you might think." Something in Buck's tone made Silas look up. There was sincerity there and concern. Whatever Jonas Whitmore was to the town, to Buck Henley, he was clearly more than just an employer. "I'll think about it," Silas said. Buck nodded. "Fair enough. If you decide to come, the ranch is easy to find. Just follow the valley road east about 10 miles. Can't miss it." He remounted his horse, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Whitmore's a good man. I've worked for him 20 years, and he's always treated me square. If he wants to thank you, it's worth hearing him out." Silas watched them ride back down the trail, then unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky but clear, the letters formed with obvious care. "Mr. Crane, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to express my gratitude for your kindness in town. It has been many years since someone offered help without expectation of payment or favor. In a world that often seems to have forgotten such values, your actions were a reminder of better times and better men. I would very much like to thank you in person and to make your acquaintance properly. I am an old man with limited time, and I have learned not to let opportunities for genuine connection pass by. Please consider visiting me at your convenience. With sincere thanks, Jonas Whitmore." Silas read it twice, then folded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He stood there for a long moment, looking out across the valley toward where the Whitmore ranch would be, hidden beyond the curve of the hills. Something about the letter troubled him, though he couldn't quite name what. Maybe it was the phrase "limited time." Maybe it was the loneliness he sensed beneath the formal words. Or maybe it was something else, some instinct that told him this was a decision that mattered more than it appeared to. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams, thinking about the old man in the wheelchair and the careful words of the letter. He thought about Buck Henley's assessment, a good man. He thought about his father, about what Jacob would have done in this situation. The answer came easily enough. Jacob would have gone. Not because he wanted a reward, but because someone had reached out in good faith, and it would be rude and small-minded to ignore that. But Silas had spent 5 years avoiding exactly this kind of thing. Connections, conversations that went beyond the practical exchange of goods and information. He'd built his isolation carefully, stone by stone, and letting someone in felt dangerous. It felt like opening a door that he'd worked hard to close. He rose before dawn and made coffee, strong and black. He stood on the porch and watched the sun come up over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Dancer nickered from the corral, sensing his restlessness. He made his decision then, the way decisions are often made, not with certainty, but with resignation to the fact that avoiding something doesn't make it go away. He saddled Dancer and rode down the mountain, following the valley road east as Buck had instructed. The morning was cool and clear, the air sharp with the scent of pine and coming autumn. He passed a few homesteads, small farms carved out of the wilderness with more hope than sense, and he nodded to a farmer, mending a fence but didn't stop to talk. The Whitmore ranch revealed itself gradually. First came the fences, sturdy and well-maintained, stretching across the grasslands like lines drawn by a careful hand. Then came the cattle, hundreds of them, grazing peacefully under the watch of mounted ranch hands. Then came the outbuildings, barns, stables, storage sheds, all built solid and painted white. And finally, the house itself. It was grand in a way that seemed almost obscene in this rough country. 2 stories of white-painted wood, with a wraparound porch and tall windows that caught the morning light. Flower gardens flanked the front steps, somehow thriving despite the harsh climate. A circular drive led to the front entrance, and several horses were tied to posts near the main barn. Everything spoke of wealth and order, of a man who had carved an empire from wilderness and maintained it through will and resources. Silas felt out of place immediately. He was dressed in his usual clothes, wool shirt, worn trousers, scuffed boots, and his hands were rough from work. He nearly turned Dancer around and rode back to the mountains. But Buck Henley had spotted him and was walking over with a welcoming smile. "Glad you came," Buck said. "Mr. Whitmore's been hoping you would." "Come on! I'll take you to him." Silas dismounted and followed Buck through the front door, his boots loud on the polished wooden floors. The interior was as impressive as the exterior. Fine furniture, paintings on the walls, a chandelier hanging in the entryway. But there was something sad about it too, something empty. It felt like a museum, more than a home. Buck led him to a study at the back of the house. Large windows overlooked the ranch lands, and bookshelves lined the walls. In a wheelchair near the window sat Jonas Whitmore, and this time Silas looked at him properly. He was thin, his frame diminished by age and illness, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, and his hands rested on the arms of the wheelchair, the same wheelchair Silas had repaired. "Mr. Crane," Jonas said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." Silas removed his hat and took the offered chair, feeling awkward and uncertain. Jonas studied him for a moment, then smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I won't keep you long," Jonas said. "I know men like you don't care much for formality or fuss. I just wanted to look you in the eye and say thank you. What you did in town might seem small to you, but it meant the world to me." "It was nothing," Silas said quietly. "It was something," Jonas countered gently. "It was kindness without agenda. It was seeing another human being in need and responding without calculating the cost or benefit. That's not nothing, Mr. Crane. That's everything." There was a pause, comfortable despite Silas's discomfort. Jonas reached to the desk beside him and pulled out a small leather pouch, which he held out. Silas could hear the clink of coins. "I can't accept that," Silas said. I know, Jonas replied, setting the pouch back down. Buck told me you'd refuse. So instead, I'm going to ask you something, and I hope you'll at least consider it before saying no. Silas waited, wary now. Jonas leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. I have a project I want to undertake. Something for the community, and I need someone honest and practical to help me manage it. Someone the townspeople trust. Someone who knows the value of hard work and helping others. He paused. I'd like that someone to be you. Silas sat back, stunned. Mr. Whitmore, I don't know anything about managing projects. I'm a trapper. I live in the mountains. I know exactly who you are, Jonas said. That's why I'm asking. I don't need a businessman. I need a good man. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small, a gold pocket watch, worn smooth with age. He opened it, and Silas could see an inscription inside, though he couldn't read it from where he sat. My wife gave me this 40 years ago, Jonas said quietly. The inscription says time is precious. Use it well. She died 10 years ago, and I've spent most of the time since then realizing I haven't used my time as well as I should have. I have wealth, Mr. Crane, but wealth without purpose is just numbers in a ledger. I want to do something that matters before my time runs out. He closed the watch and looked directly at Silas. I don't expect an answer today. Think about it. Come back when you're ready, whether that's tomorrow or next month. But please at least consider it. Silas stood, hat in hand, his mind churning. I'll think on it, he said finally. Jonas nodded, satisfied. That's all I ask. As Buck walked him back to his horse, Silas felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He'd come expecting a simple thank you, maybe an awkward exchange of pleasantries. Instead, he was riding away with a question that had no easy answer, and a sense that his carefully constructed solitude was about to come to an end. For 2 days, Silas wrestled with Jonas's offer. He went through the motions of his daily routine, checking traps, chopping wood, tending to Dancer, but his mind was elsewhere. The question followed him like a shadow. What did Jonas want exactly? And more importantly, why did the idea of saying yes fill him with equal parts fear and something that might have been hope? On the evening of the second day, he sat at his small table and opened Sarah's recipe book. He hadn't looked at it in months, maybe longer. The pages were yellowed and stained from use, and her handwriting flowed across them in neat, careful lines. Recipes for bread, for stew, for the apple pie she'd made every autumn when the wild apples ripened. But between the recipes were other things, notes, observations, small thoughts she'd written down. On one page, tucked between instructions for preserving beans, she'd written, Silas fixed Mrs. Cooper's wagon wheel today. Wouldn't take any payment. I'm proud of him. He has his father's heart. Reading those words, written in her hand, felt like hearing her voice again. And with it came a clarity he'd been avoiding. Sarah would have wanted him to help. She'd always been the one who drew him out of himself, who reminded him that there was a world beyond their small cabin and that they had a responsibility to be part of it. She'd organized quilting circles, brought meals to sick neighbors, taught reading to children whose parents couldn't. She'd believed in community, in connection, in using whatever you had to make things better for others. The next morning, Silas rode to town, not to the Whitmore ranch, but to the general store. He needed to talk to someone who knew Jonas Whitmore better than Buck Henley's professional assessment, someone who understood the town and its dynamics. He needed Martha Hayes. The store was quiet when he entered, just Martha behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of canned goods. She looked up and smiled, surprise and pleasure crossing her face. Silas Crane, twice in 1 week. Should I be worried? He managed a small smile. Need to ask you something, Martha. About Jonas Whitmore. Her expression shifted, becoming more serious. She set down the cans and gestured to a pair of chairs near the stove. Sit down. I'll make coffee. They sat with their cups, and Silas told her about the wheelchair, the visit from Buck, his trip to the ranch, and Jonas's proposition. Martha listened without interrupting, her weathered face thoughtful. Jonas Whitmore is a complicated man, she said when he'd finished. Rich as Croesus, powerful as anyone in 3 territories. But he's lonely, Silas. His wife, Elizabeth, was a good woman. She kept him grounded, reminded him that money wasn't everything. After she died, he threw himself into building his empire, I think, because he didn't know what else to do with the grief. His children left years ago. They wanted city life, fancy schools, society. Can't blame them, really, but it broke Jonas's heart. She sipped her coffee, looking past Silas toward the window. He's been different this past year, quieter, more thoughtful. Word is his health isn't good. Doc Harrison won't say much, but people talk. I think Jonas knows his time is running short, and he's trying to figure out what to leave behind, besides money and land. He said he wants to do something for the community, Silas said. Asked me to help manage it. And you're wondering if you can trust him, Martha said. It wasn't a question. I'm wondering why me, Silas replied. I'm nobody. I don't know anything about managing projects or working with people. I live alone in the mountains because I prefer it that way. Martha set down her cup and looked at him directly. Do you, though? Prefer it that way? The question hit harder than he'd expected. I did, he said quietly. After Sarah, it seemed easier to just step away from everything. Grief makes us do that, Martha said gently. Makes us want to hide away where nothing can hurt us again. But Silas, Sarah wouldn't want you living like a ghost. She loved people. She loved this town. She loved you, and she'd want you to keep living, not just existing. He stared at his coffee, throat tight. I know. Jonas is offering you a way back, Martha continued. Not into the life you had. That's gone, and no amount of wishing will bring it back. But into a different life, one that might have purpose and meaning. Sarah would have wanted that for you. I think you know that, or you wouldn't be here asking me about it. They sat in silence for a while, the old store creaking around them. Finally, Silas spoke. What if I'm not the right person? What if I fail? Then you fail, Martha said simply. But at least you tried. That's more than most people can say. She reached across and patted his hand, her touch warm and brief. Talk to him, Silas, really talk to him. Find out exactly what he has in mind. Then make your decision based on what you hear, not on your fear of stepping back into the world. Silas rode out to the Whitmore ranch that afternoon. This time, he felt less like an intruder and more like someone with business to conduct. Buck greeted him again and led him to the same study, where Jonas sat reading a leather-bound book. He looked up and smiled when Silas entered. Mr. Crane, I hoped I'd see you again soon. I want to hear more about this project, Silas said, sitting down without preamble. What exactly are you planning? Jonas set aside his book, and Silas could see it was a Bible, well-worn and marked with countless annotations. I want to build a community workshop, Jonas said. A place where people can come to learn skills, carpentry, metalwork, leathercraft, basic repairs. A place where broken things can be fixed and where people who need help can get it without feeling like charity cases. He leaned forward, his expression animated in a way that made him seem younger. Too many families in Copper Ridge are struggling, Silas. Farms failing because a man doesn't know how to repair his plow properly. Houses falling apart because people can't afford to hire someone to fix them. Children growing up without learning the practical skills they need to make their way in the world. I have the money to build the workshop and stock it with tools, but I need someone to run it. Someone who knows how to work with their hands. Someone patient enough to teach. Someone honest enough that people will trust them. And you think that's me? Silas asked. I know it is, Jonas replied. I've asked around about you, Silas. You're respected. People remember your father. Jacob Crane was known as a fair and skilled man. They remember your wife Sarah, how she was always helping others. And they remember you before you retreated to the mountains. You're not a stranger to this community. You're just someone who stepped away for a while. Silas felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. I'd still need to live in the mountains, he said. I couldn't give that up entirely. I wouldn't ask you to, Jonas said. Come to town 3 days a week or 4, whatever works. The rest of the time, live as you always have. I'm not trying to change who you are, Silas. I'm just asking you to share what you know with people who need it. There was a long pause. Silas looked out the window at the ranch lands, at the mountains beyond, at the sky that seemed to stretch forever. He thought about Sarah's words in her recipe book. He thought about his father, about the values Jacob had instilled in him. He thought about the past 5 years of isolation and the slow erosion of purpose that had come with it. "I'll do it," he said finally, "on a trial basis. If it's not working, if I'm not the right person, we stop." Jonas's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's all I can ask." "Thank you, Silas." They spent the next hour discussing details. Jonas had already identified a plot of land near the center of town, close enough to be accessible but large enough for a proper building. He'd arranged for lumber and materials to be delivered. He'd even sketched out rough plans for the structure, simple but functional, with workspace for different crafts and storage for tools. "When do we start?" Silas asked. "As soon as possible," Jonas said. "Winter comes early in Montana. I'd like to have the building up and enclosed before the first snow." Silas nodded. "It was ambitious but not impossible. I'll need help with the construction. I've already spoken to Buck. He'll assign some ranch hands to assist, and I'll put out word that we're hiring day laborers. We'll pay fair wages." Jonas paused, then added, "And Silas, you'll be paid too. This isn't volunteer work. It's a job, and you deserve compensation." "We can discuss that later," Silas said, uncomfortable with the topic. "We'll discuss it now," Jonas said firmly but kindly. $50 a month to start, plus expenses for materials and travel. That's non-negotiable. It was more money than Silas had seen in years. He wanted to refuse, but he could see the determination in Jonas's eyes. This mattered to the old man, and turning down the salary would be an insult to his vision. "All right," Silas said. $50 a month. They shook hands, Jonas's grip surprisingly strong for a man so frail. As Silas rode away from the ranch that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years, a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. It scared him and steadied him in equal measure. The mountains would still be there when he needed them. But now there was something else too. Something that might just possibly be worth the risk of caring again. The first stone was laid on a Tuesday morning in late September, with the sun bright and the air crisp enough to see your breath. Silas had marked out the foundation himself, using stakes and string to create a rectangle, 40 feet by 30 feet, large enough for multiple workstations, but not so large that it would feel empty if only a few people showed up. A small crowd had gathered to watch. Maybe 20 townspeople curious about what Jonas Whitmore and the Mountain Man were building. Sheriff Brennan was there, leaning against a post and watching with his usual quiet assessment. Martha Hayes had closed her store for an hour to attend, and she'd brought fresh bread and coffee for the workers. Even Reverend Price had come, offering a brief blessing that Silas tolerated because it seemed to mean something to the others. The foundation stone was a large piece of granite that Silas and 2 ranch hands had hauled from a quarry 5 miles north. It was smooth and gray, solid and permanent. Jonas had wanted something that would last, and granite would outlive them all. They set it at the northeast corner, the traditional place for a foundation stone, and Silas used a level to make sure it was true. "There," he said, straightening up. "That's the start." The work proceeded steadily over the following weeks. Buck Henley had assigned 4 ranch hands to help full-time, and they proved to be good workers, strong, reliable, and willing to take direction. Silas found himself falling into the rhythm of construction, the physical labor, both familiar and satisfying. They dug the foundation trenches, laid stone footings, and began framing the walls with heavy timber. Townspeople stopped by throughout the days, some just watching, others offering to help. Silas was surprised by how many wanted to be involved. Men who worked other jobs would show up in the evenings and work for an hour or 2 before heading home. Women brought food and water. Children ran around the construction site until their mothers shooed them away, worried they'd get hurt. One of the regular visitors was a boy named Timothy Morrison. He was 12 years old, all knees and elbows, with sandy hair that stuck up no matter how many times he pushed it down. His family had a small farm a few miles outside of town, and Timothy would walk in after finishing his morning chores to watch the construction. He never got in the way, just stood at a respectful distance and observed everything with intense interest. After a week of this, Silas walked over to him during a break. "You planning to stand there all day, or you want to learn something?" Timothy's face lit up. "I can help." "If your folks don't mind," Silas said. "Always use an extra pair of hands, and you look strong enough to carry tools and fetch materials." The boy practically vibrated with excitement. "My pa's laid up with a bad back. Ma says I can work if someone's willing to teach me. We don't have money to pay, though." "Didn't ask for money," Silas said. "Asked if you wanted to learn. There's a difference." Timothy became a fixture at the site after that. Silas started teaching him basic carpentry, how to hold a hammer properly, how to saw in a straight line, how to read a level and a square. The boy was quick to learn and eager to please, and Silas found himself enjoying the teaching more than he'd expected. There was something satisfying about passing knowledge to the next generation, about seeing understanding dawn in a young mind. One afternoon, as they were working on the wall frames, Timothy said, "My pa used to teach me things before his back went bad." "What happened?" Silas asked, holding a board steady while Timothy hammered, lifting something too heavy. "Doctor says he'll never work the farm properly again." The boy's voice was carefully neutral, but Silas could hear the worry beneath it. "Ma's trying to keep things going, but it's hard. We might have to sell." Silas thought about that as they worked. The Morrisons were one of many families in Copper Ridge, barely hanging on, one misfortune away from losing everything. It was exactly the kind of situation Jonas's workshop was meant to address, not with charity, but by giving people skills and tools to solve their own problems. "When this place is finished," Silas said, "your pa will be able to come here and learn new skills, things he can do even with a bad back. There's always work for a man who knows how to repair things, do leather work, craft tools. It's not farming, but it's honest work that pays." Timothy looked up at him, hope flickering in his young eyes. "You think so?" "I know so," Silas replied. The workshop's frame went up by mid-October, the skeleton of the building dark against the autumn sky. They'd made good progress, working dawn to dusk most days, and the structure was taking shape faster than Silas had expected. The walls were framed, the roof trusses were up, and they'd begun laying the planking for the roof itself. But not everyone in Copper Ridge was pleased with the project. Clayton Mercer owned the largest mercantile in town, a sprawling establishment that sold everything from farm equipment to fabric to tools. He also ran a repair service, charging high prices to fix broken implements and equipment. The workshop represented direct competition to his business, and he'd made his displeasure known. It started with small things. A lumber delivery that was delayed by a week because the order had mysteriously been changed. Permits that required additional signatures and fees that hadn't been mentioned before. Town council meetings where Mercer raised concerns about safety and proper oversight of the project. Jonas had warned Silas that there might be opposition. "Mercer's got influence," he'd said, "and he doesn't like change, especially change that might cost him money. Be prepared for him to make things difficult." The opposition became harder to ignore when tools started disappearing from the construction site. First it was just small items. A hammer here, a bag of nails there, things that could have been misplaced or borrowed without asking. But then a whole toolbox went missing overnight, and the day after that, someone cut through several supporting beams that had already been installed, forcing them to be replaced. Sheriff Brennan investigated, walking the site and asking questions, but there was no evidence pointing to anyone specific. "Could be just troublemakers," he said, though his tone suggested he suspected otherwise. "I'll increase patrols at night, see if we can catch anyone in the act." Silas kept working, refusing to let the sabotage slow them down more than necessary. But the incidents created tension among the workers. Some of the day laborers stopped showing up, worried about being associated with a project that was drawing negative attention. Others became more committed, angry that someone would try to undermine something meant to help the community. The division in the town became more apparent as October wore on. There were those who supported the workshop, families who saw it as a lifeline, people who admired Jonas's generosity, folks who simply liked the idea of a community space. And there were those who aligned with Mercer, either because they owed him money, feared his influence, or genuinely believed that charity undermined self-reliance. Martha Hayes tried to keep the peace, as she always did. She hosted coffee gatherings at her store, where people could discuss their concerns openly. But the rift was widening, and even her considerable diplomacy could only do so much. Through it all, Silas kept building. He found himself thinking less about the mountains and his solitary cabin, more about the workshop and what it could become. He enjoyed working with Timothy, seeing the boy's skills develop. He appreciated the quiet camaraderie of the other workers, the way they'd share a drink of water and a few words during breaks. He even started having occasional dinners with Jonas at the ranch. The two men developing a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. One evening, as they sat on Jonas's porch watching the sunset, the old man said, "You're different than when we first met." Silas considered that. "How so?" "Less guarded," Jonas said. "More present. You look people in the eye now when you talk to them." It was true, Silas realized. He'd been so closed off for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. The workshop wasn't just a building. It was a bridge back to the world, and he was crossing it one plank at a time. "Thank you," Silas said quietly. Jonas glanced at him. "For what?" "For not letting me stay hidden," Silas replied. "For seeing something in me I'd forgotten was there." The old man smiled, but there was sadness in it too. "We all need someone to remind us who we are sometimes. Your father did that for me once long ago. I'm glad I could do it for his son." It was the first time Jonas had mentioned Silas's father specifically, and something in the way he said it made Silas look over sharply. But Jonas had turned back to the sunset, and the moment passed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Two men finding unexpected friendship in the twilight of one life and the rekindling of another. The workshop opened on the first Saturday of November, with snow already dusting the mountain peaks and the smell of winter in the air. They'd finished the building just in time, the walls solid, the roof tight, and a good wood stove installed to keep the space warm. Inside, workbenches lined the walls, each equipped with the tools needed for different trades. There was space for carpentry, metalwork, leathercraft, and general repairs. Shelves held additional supplies, all carefully organized and labeled. Jonas had insisted on a small celebration for the opening. Nothing fancy, just coffee and Martha's famous apple cake, and an opportunity for the community to see what had been built. To Silas's surprise, nearly 100 people showed up, filling the workshop and spilling out into the yard. Families came in their Sunday best, children running excitedly through the space, men examining the tools with appreciation, women discussing how their households might benefit from the services offered. Silas stood near the back, uncomfortable with the attention but pleased by the turnout. Jonas was there in his wheelchair, looking frailer than he had even a month ago, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. Sheriff Brennan had positioned himself near the door, keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. Martha worked the room like the social expert she was, introducing people to Silas and talking up the workshop's potential. Timothy Morrison stood beside Silas, practically bursting with pride. The boy had worked hard over the past weeks, and Silas had tasked him with building something special for the opening, a birdhouse. It had taken Timothy 3 tries to get it right, but the final product was solid and well-crafted, with clean joints and a roof that would shed rain properly. They'd mounted it on a post outside the workshop entrance, and Silas had let Timothy hammer in the final nail. "Did you ever think you'd see this many people interested in something you built?" Timothy asked. "Never gave it much thought," Silas admitted, "but it's good to see. Your birdhouse turned out fine, by the way. Your pa would be proud." The boy's face glowed. "He is. He came in special for this, even though the ride hurt his back. Said he wouldn't miss it." Silas spotted Mr. Morrison across the room, a thin man in his 40s who moved carefully, as if every step pained him. He was talking to another farmer, both of them examining the leather working tools with interest. It struck Silas that this was exactly what Jonas had envisioned, people finding possibilities where before there had been only limitations. Jonas gave a short speech from his wheelchair, his voice thin but clear. He thanked everyone for coming and explained his vision for the workshop, a place where skills could be learned, where broken things could be mended, where the community could come together to help one another. He didn't mention the opposition or the sabotage. He kept his words positive and forward-looking, and when he finished, people applauded warmly. Then Jonas did something unexpected. He gestured for Silas to join him at the front. Silas felt his stomach tighten, but he couldn't refuse without making things awkward. He walked through the crowd, acutely aware of eyes on him. "This man," Jonas said, resting a hand briefly on Silas's shoulder, "is the one who made this possible, not just by building the structure, but by understanding what it could mean for this community." Silas Crane embodies the values this workshop stands for: skill, generosity, and the willingness to help others. I'm honored to call him a friend. The applause that followed made Silas's ears burn. He managed a few words of thanks, explaining that the workshop was open to anyone who needed it, that he'd be there 3 days a week to teach and assist, and that he hoped people would take advantage of what Jonas had so generously provided. Then he retreated as quickly as he could, leaving Jonas to field questions from eager townspeople. The weeks that followed exceeded Silas's expectations. People came to the workshop daily, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Farmers brought in broken tools to be repaired. Women brought household items that needed mending. Young men came to learn skills that might help them find work. Silas found himself teaching constantly, showing someone how to sharpen a blade properly, helping another person understand wood grain and how to work with it rather than against it, demonstrating the basics of forge work to a teenager who dreamed of becoming a blacksmith. Timothy was there almost every day after finishing his morning chores. The boy had become Silas's unofficial assistant, helping organize tools, cleaning up after projects, and learning everything he could absorb. Silas taught him patiently, the way his own father had taught him, and watched with quiet satisfaction as Timothy's skills grew. But the workshop's success only deepened Clayton Mercer's resentment. Business at his repair service had dropped noticeably, and he blamed Jonas's charity project for undermining honest enterprise. The opposition that had been simmering came to a boil one afternoon in mid-November. Silas was working with a group of farmers, teaching them how to repair harness leather, when 3 men walked into the workshop. One was Mercer himself, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. The other 2 were associates of his, rough-looking men who worked as enforcers for his various business interests. The workshop went quiet. Everyone recognized Mercer, and everyone knew about his opposition to the project. "Can I help you?" Silas asked, setting down the leather piece he'd been working on. "Just wanted to see what all the fuss is about," Mercer said, looking around with obvious disdain. "All these free services, free tools, free teaching. Must be nice not having to actually earn a living. People learn here so they can earn their own livings," Silas said evenly. "That's the whole point. Point is to put honest businessmen out of work," Mercer countered. "I've been providing repair services in this town for 20 years. Now Jonas Whitmore decides to play the generous benefactor, and suddenly I'm the villain for charging fair prices for my expertise." "Nobody's calling you a villain," Silas said. "And nobody's forced to come here? It's just another option, an option that's killing my business," Mercer snapped. His face was reddening now, anger rising. "You and Whitmore thinking you can buy your way into people's respect. Well, some of us remember what real work looks like." One of the farmers spoke up, an older man named Hendricks. "Clayton, you charged me $15 to fix a plow blade last year. Silas taught me how to do it myself in an hour, and now I can fix any blade I own. That's not putting you out of work. That's teaching me to be self-sufficient." Mercer turned on him. And when your plow breaks in a way you can't fix, Hendricks, when you need real expertise, you'll come crawling back, and maybe I'll help you, and maybe I won't. That's enough. Sheriff Brennan's voice cut through the tension. Silas hadn't noticed him enter, but he was standing just inside the door, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. You've made your point, Clayton. Time to move along. Mercer glared at the sheriff, then at Silas. This isn't over. Jonas Whitmore's manipulating this town, and you're helping him do it. When people figure that out, they'll see you for what you really are, just another con man with a sob story about a dead wife. The room went deathly silent. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest, but he kept his voice level. You need to leave now, or what? Mercer challenged. You going to throw me out? I'd like to see you try. Silas didn't move, didn't rise to the bait. He just stood there, calm and steady, until the silence became uncomfortable. It was Timothy who broke it, stepping forward with surprising courage for a 12-year-old. Mr. Silas taught me how to build, the boy said, his voice shaking slightly but determined. He taught me for free because he's a good man. My family was falling apart, and he gave us hope. You can say whatever you want about him, but everyone here knows the truth. Other voices joined in then. People speaking up about how the workshop had helped them. How Silas had been patient and generous with his knowledge. How Jonas's vision was making a real difference. Mercer found himself facing not just Silas, but an entire room of people who had benefited from what he was trying to tear down. He left, his associates trailing behind him, but his parting words hung in the air like smoke. This isn't finished. After they were gone, Sheriff Brennan walked over to Silas. That was ugly. It was, Silas agreed. He's not going to let this go, Brennan continued. Mercer's the type who holds grudges, and he's got enough influence in this town to cause real problems. What kind of problems? Legal ones, probably. He'll try to find ways to shut you down. Safety violations, permit issues, any technicality he can exploit. And if that doesn't work, Brennan paused, his expression grim. Well, let's just say Mercer's not above hiring people to solve his problems in less legal ways. Silas absorbed this. He'd known there would be opposition, but he'd underestimated how personal it would become. The mention of Sarah had been a low blow, and it had hit harder than he wanted to admit. That evening, Silas rode out to Jonas's ranch. He found the old man in his study, looking more tired than usual. They'd been having these evening conversations regularly now, and Silas had come to value them. Jonas had a way of putting things in perspective, of seeing the larger picture when Silas got caught up in the immediate difficulties. Mercer came by the workshop today, Silas said, after they'd settled in with coffee. Made his feelings pretty clear. Jonas nodded slowly. I heard. Word travels fast in a small town. I'm sorry he brought Sarah into it. That was uncalled for. It's what desperate men do, Silas said. Still stings, though. Of course it does. Jonas was quiet for a moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. I want to show you something. These are entries from my personal diary. I don't usually share them, but I think you should see this particular passage. He opened to a marked page and handed the journal to Silas. The entry was dated 3 weeks earlier, and as Silas read it, he felt a chill run through him. The entry described Jonas's joy at watching Silas lead the workshop, his satisfaction at seeing the community respond positively, and his conviction that he'd made the right choice. But it also contained something else, a reflection on Jonas's own mortality and his determination to use his remaining time meaningfully. The final line read, Jacob would be proud of his son. I'm proud to call Silas friend. You mentioned my father before, Silas said quietly, looking up from the journal. How did you know him? Jonas met his eyes, and Silas saw something shift in the old man's expression, a decision being made, a secret being brought into the light. That, Jonas said slowly, is a conversation we need to have. But not tonight. I'm tired, and what I need to tell you deserves better than a weary old man's rambling. Come back tomorrow evening. I promise I'll explain everything then. Silas wanted to press, but he could see the exhaustion in Jonas's face. Whatever the old man needed to say, it could wait one more day. He agreed and rode back to his cabin under a sky full of stars, his mind churning with questions he couldn't yet answer. Silas arrived at the Whitmore ranch just as the sun was setting the next evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Buck Henley met him at the door with an expression that told Silas something had changed. "He's had a rough day," Buck said quietly. "Doctor was here this morning. Says his heart's getting weaker, but he's been waiting for you. Wouldn't rest until you got here." Jonas was in his study as usual, but he looked diminished somehow, as if whatever energy had been sustaining him was finally running out. Still, his eyes were alert when Silas entered, and he managed to smile. "Thank you for coming," Jonas said. "Pour yourself a drink. There's whiskey in the cabinet. This is going to take a while, and you might need it." Silas poured 2 glasses and handed one to Jonas, then settled into his usual chair. The old man took a small sip, grimaced slightly, then set the glass aside and reached for a wooden box on his desk. He opened it and withdrew a stack of papers, legal documents by the look of them, and something else. A photograph. "Before I tell you the story," Jonas said, "I need you to look at this." He handed Silas the photograph. It was old, the edges worn and the image faded to sepia tones. It showed 2 young men, maybe in their 20s, standing in front of a rough mountain cabin. They were dressed in the heavy clothes of prospectors or trappers, and both were smiling at the camera. Silas's breath caught. One of the men he didn't recognize. The other was his father, Jacob Crane, 40 years younger but unmistakable. "That's my father," Silas said, his voice rough. "And that's me," Jonas replied, pointing to the other man. "Taken 42 years ago, up in the mountains about 60 miles northeast of here. Your father saved my life that winter." Silas stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the young man in the image with the wealthy rancher sitting before him. "Tell me," he said. Jonas took another small sip of whiskey. "When I finally recovered, I tried to pay him. I had a little gold I'd found, nothing much, but I offered it all to him. He refused, said helping people was what decent folks did, and he didn't need payment for being decent. I told him that if I ever struck it rich, I'd find a way to repay him. He laughed and said, 'Just pass the kindness forward someday, son. That's payment enough.'" Silas felt his throat tighten. It sounded exactly like something his father would say. "A month after I left Jacob's cabin," Jonas continued, "I struck gold. Real gold, a vein rich enough to set me up for life. I sold the claim for more money than I'd ever imagined having, and I used that money to start buying land, building the ranch, investing. Everything you see here, everything I've built, started because your father saved my life and taught me that kindness matters more than gold." "Why didn't you find him?" Silas asked. "Why didn't you thank him?" "I tried," Jonas said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "I went back to that cabin the next summer, but he was gone. I asked around, but nobody knew where Jacob Crane had moved to. The frontier was big, Silas. People came and went, and tracking someone down was nearly impossible if they didn't want to be found. I kept looking on and off for years, but I never found him." He gestured to the papers on the desk. 20 years ago, I hired investigators to search for him. They finally tracked down records showing Jacob Crane had settled in these mountains in the 1850s, had married, had a son. But by the time I learned that, your father had died. The avalanche, I learned. I'm sorry I never got to thank him properly." Silas was struggling to process this. His father had never mentioned saving anyone's life, had never talked about knowing Jonas Whitmore. But then, Jacob had been a private man, not given to bragging about his good deeds. "I found out about you a few years after that," Jonas continued. "Learned you'd married Sarah Brennan, Tom's cousin, and that you lived in the high country like your father had. But I didn't approach you. I told myself it was because I didn't know what to say, how to explain. But the truth is, I was a coward. I'd built this empire, but I'd never fulfilled my promise to Jacob to pass the kindness forward. I'd gotten caught up in making money and building power, and I'd forgotten what mattered." He looked directly at Silas now, his eyes shining. "Then my wife died, and my children left, and I realized I was running out of time. I started thinking about legacy, about what I'd leave behind, and I remembered Jacob's words. I started planning the community project, but I didn't know who to trust to run it. And then, that day in town, I saw you fix my wheelchair. I didn't recognize you at first, not until Buck mentioned your name. Then it all came together. Jacob's son, living the way Jacob lived, showing the same values Jacob showed me all those years ago. The wheelchair wasn't an accident, Silas said slowly. You knew who I was. The wheelchair breaking was an accident, Jonas corrected, but you stopping to help, that wasn't random chance. That was character. That was Jacob's teaching living on in you. And that's when I knew. I'd been looking for the right person to help me pass forward the kindness Jacob showed me. And there you were, his son, embodying everything he'd taught you. Silas set down the photograph with shaking hands. Everything made sense now. Jonas's immediate trust, his insistence on Silas managing the workshop, his references to Jacob, the bond that had formed between them. It wasn't random at all. It was a circle closing, a debt being paid across generations. I don't know what to say, Silas admitted. You don't have to say anything, Jonas replied. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that none of this was manipulation or charity. This was me keeping a promise I made 42 years ago to a man who saved my life and asked for nothing in return except that I pass the kindness forward. You've been doing that your whole life, Silas, probably without even realizing it. You're your father's son, in the best possible way. He pushed the stack of legal documents across the desk. These are papers establishing a community trust. It's funded with a substantial portion of my estate, enough to keep the workshop running and expand its services for decades to come. I'm naming you as one of the trustees, along with my lawyer, Edward Hastings. You'll have authority to make decisions about how the money is used, what programs to create, how to serve the community best. Jonas, I can't, Silas started. You can, and you will, Jonas interrupted gently but firmly. This isn't about you being qualified or deserving. This is about you being the right person. Jacob was right when he said kindness should be passed forward. I'm passing it to you. And someday, when you're old and your time is running short, you'll pass it forward to someone else. That's how the world gets better, Silas. One act of kindness at a time, rippling forward through generations. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of revelation settling between them. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice thick with emotion. My father would have been proud to know he taught you something important. He taught me everything important, Jonas said quietly. And now, I'm hoping to do the same for you, just as Jacob did for his son. Use the trust wisely, Silas. Build something that lasts. Make sure people remember that kindness matters, that helping others isn't weakness but the greatest strength we have. Silas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He understood now why. Jonas had waited to tell him why this revelation had been held until after the workshop was built and Silas was committed. If he'd known from the beginning, he might have refused out of a sense of obligation or inadequacy. But now, having already stepped into the role, having already seen what the workshop could do, he couldn't walk away, and he didn't want to. Thank you, Silas said finally, for telling me, for trusting me, for keeping your promise to my father. Thank you for being the man Jacob raised you to be, Jonas replied. Now, go home. Rest. Tomorrow we'll start working on expanding the workshop's programs. We still have work to do, and time is short. As Silas rode back to his cabin that night, the photograph tucked safely in his pocket, he felt as if he finally understood his place in the world. He wasn't just a grieving widower hiding in the mountains. He was part of something larger, a chain of kindness stretching across decades, connecting past to present to future. His father's values lived on in him, and through the workshop they would live on in others long after both Jonas and Silas were gone. The mountains rose dark against the starlit sky, eternal and unchanging, but Silas had changed. He'd been transformed by friendship, by purpose, by the revelation that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create ripples we never see, touching lives we'll never meet in ways we can't imagine. Jonas Whitmore died 3 days later. Silas was at the workshop, teaching a group of young men how to properly temper steel, when Buck Henley rode up. One look at the foreman's face told him everything he needed to know. They rode to the ranch, together in silence, arriving to find Doc Harrison's wagon still in the drive and Sheriff Brennan's horse tied nearby. Jonas had passed peacefully in his sleep, Buck explained. The doctor said his heart had simply given out. No pain, no struggle, just a quiet ending to a long life. It was, Buck said with tears in his eyes, the way Jonas would have wanted it. The funeral was held 4 days later at the Copper Ridge Church. Despite the cold November weather, nearly every resident of the town attended, along with ranch hands, business associates from as far away as Helena, and even Jonas's children, who had finally made the journey from back east. The church was packed, people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. Silas had been asked to deliver the eulogy. He'd spent 2 sleepless nights trying to figure out what to say, how to capture the man Jonas had been without revealing the private story that connected them. In the end, he kept it simple and honest. He spoke about Jonas's generosity, about his vision for a community where people helped one another. He talked about the workshop and what it represented, not charity, but opportunity. He mentioned Jonas's conviction that wealth without purpose was meaningless, and that true legacy was measured not in dollars, but in lives touched and improved. Jonas Whitmore taught me something important, Silas said, looking out at the sea of faces. He taught me that the kindness we show others doesn't end with us. It ripples forward, touching people we'll never meet, creating changes we'll never see. He believed that each of us has the power to make the world a little better, a little kinder, if we're willing to try. And he spent his life proving that belief true. He didn't mention his father. That story was too personal, too precious to share with a crowd. But as he spoke, his hand rested in his pocket, touching the photograph Jonas had given him, and he felt his father's presence there, alongside Jonas's memory. The reading of the will took place 2 days after the funeral, in Jonas's study at the ranch. Present were Jonas's 2 children, Richard and Elizabeth, Edward Hastings the lawyer, Buck Henley, Sheriff Brennan as a witness, and Silas. The children were in their 40s, well-dressed city folk who seemed uncomfortable in their father's frontier home. They'd been polite to Silas, but distant, clearly uncertain what to make of the mountain man their father had befriended. Edward Hastings was a serious man in his 60s, grey-haired and dignified, with the careful manner of someone who dealt in weighty matters. He began by reading the standard provisions. The ranch and most of the business holdings would be sold, with proceeds divided between Richard and Elizabeth. Personal items and family heirlooms would go to them as well. It was all very proper and expected. Then Hastings reached the section about the community trust. "To be established immediately upon my death," he read, "is the Jacob Crane and Jonas Whitmore Community Trust. To be funded with the sum of $200,000. There was a sharp intake of breath from Richard. $200,000 was a substantial fortune. Even by Jonas's standards, Hastings continued, "The trust shall be administered by 2 trustees, Edward Hastings, acting as legal advisor, and Silas Crane, acting as primary director. The funds shall be used to maintain and expand the community workshop, to establish educational programs, to provide assistance to families in need, and to generally serve the betterment of Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory. All decisions regarding the use of trust funds shall require agreement of both trustees." "This is absurd," Richard said, standing up. $200,000 handed over to, no offense, Mr. Crane, a virtual stranger. Father must have been out of his mind. Your father was of completely sound mind when he made these arrangements, Hastings said calmly. "I witnessed the signing personally. and Doc Harrison provided medical certification of his mental competence specifically to prevent any such challenges. Elizabeth was staring at Silas with undisguised suspicion. "How long did you know our father, Mr. Crane?" "A few months," Silas said quietly. "But he knew my father 40 years ago. Jonas was honoring a debt he felt he owed. What debt could possibly justify this?" Richard demanded. Silas hesitated, then decided they deserved to know at least part of the truth. "My father saved his life during a blizzard in the winter of 1843. Jonas tried to repay him, but my father refused payment. He only asked that Jonas pass the kindness forward someday. The trust is Jonas keeping that promise." The siblings exchanged glances. "Do you have any proof of this?" Elizabeth asked. Silas pulled the photograph from his pocket and handed it to her. She studied it, then passed it to Richard, who looked at it with a furrowed brow. "This could be anyone," Richard said, though his tone was less certain now. "It's authenticated in my files," Hastings said, along with Jonas's personal journal entries documenting his search for Jacob Crane's family and his reasons for establishing the trust. "Everything is legally sound and properly documented. We'll contest this," Richard said, handing the photograph back to Silas. "It's clearly undue influence. This man manipulated our father when he was vulnerable." "That's your right," Hastings replied. "But I should inform you that contesting the will would be expensive and, in my professional opinion, futile. Your father anticipated this possibility and took extensive measures to ensure his wishes would be respected." Sheriff Brennan spoke up from where he'd been standing silently. "I knew Jonas Whitmore for 20 years. He was the shrewdest man I ever met. If he wanted Silas to have this responsibility, he had good reason. And I've watched Silas run that workshop for months now. He's done nothing but good for this community. We don't even live here," Elizabeth said, though her tone was more resigned than angry now. "We don't know these people or understand what Father was trying to do. Then maybe," Hastings suggested gently, "you should trust that your father knew what he was doing. He loved you both. He left you substantial inheritances. But he also loved this community, and he wanted to ensure its future was secured. Is that really so hard to accept?" The siblings left an hour later, unhappy but not actively hostile. They'd stopped short of threatening legal action, though Richard made it clear they'd be watching closely to ensure the trust funds were used appropriately. Silas couldn't blame them for their suspicion. From their perspective, he must have looked like an opportunist who'd taken advantage of their dying father. After they'd gone, Hastings turned to Silas. "That went better than I expected, actually. I thought they'd file papers immediately. Will they contest it eventually?" Silas asked. "Probably not," Hastings said. "Once they calm down and review the documentation, they'll realize it's airtight. Jonas was thorough, borderline obsessive about making sure this couldn't be challenged successfully." He paused, studying Silas with the same careful assessment he probably used in courtrooms. "He believed in you quite strongly, you know. Talked about you constantly in those last weeks. Said you reminded him of the man he'd been before he got caught up in accumulating wealth. I don't know if I'm up to this," Silas admitted. "Jonas thought you were," Hastings replied. "And in my experience, Jonas Whitmore was rarely wrong about people. But understand this, Mr. Crane, you'll face opposition. The trust represents a significant change in how this community operates, and change always creates resistance." "Clayton Mercer," Silas said, "among others. Mercer's already been making noise, suggesting the trust is illegal or immoral. He's calling for a town meeting to discuss it. He's also, and this is where it gets concerning, been talking to the territorial governor's office about investigating Jonas's affairs. He's claiming fraud and manipulation." Silas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Can he actually cause problems?" "He can try," Hastings said. "And with his connections and influence, he might succeed in forcing a formal hearing. If that happens, you'll need to testify. You'll need to defend Jonas's character and your own. It won't be pleasant. I'll do whatever's necessary," Silas said. "Good." Hastings gathered his papers and stood. "I'll begin the formal process of establishing the trust. In the meantime, keep running the workshop as you have been. Document everything, every dollar spent, every person helped, every class taught. If we end up in court, we'll need evidence that the trust is being used exactly as Jonas intended. That evening, Silas sat alone in the workshop after everyone had gone home. The space was quiet, just the creak of wood settling and the wind outside. He looked around at the benches, the tools, the projects in various stages of completion. This was Jonas's legacy, built on his father's kindness, sustained by trust between generations. He thought about Richard and Elizabeth's suspicion, about Mercer's threats, about the hearing that might be coming. Part of him wanted to walk away, to return to the mountains and the simple isolation he'd known before. But he'd made a promise to Jonas, and more than that, he'd made a promise to himself. He'd come back to life these past months, reconnected with purpose and community, and he couldn't retreat now. No matter how difficult things got, he pulled out the photograph one more time, looking at his young father standing beside young Jonas, two men whose choices 40 years ago had led to this moment. The circle had closed, but it wasn't finished. It would continue forward through him, through Timothy and the others learning at the workshop, through every person whose life was touched by the kindness that Jacob Crane had started and Jonas Whitmore had amplified. "I won't let you down," Silas said quietly to the photograph, to the memories, to the legacy he now carried. "Either of you." He locked up the workshop and rode home under a sky full of winter stars, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead, but finally believing he had the strength to face it. The town meeting was called for the first Saturday in December, to be held in the church, since it was the only building large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. Clayton Mercer had been busy in the 2 weeks since Jonas's funeral, spreading doubt and gathering supporters. His message was simple and effective. Jonas Whitmore had been manipulated in his final months by a stranger who now controlled a fortune meant for the community. Silas spent those 2 weeks preparing in his own way. He continued running the workshop, documenting everything as Hastings had advised. He kept careful records of who came in, what they learned, what materials were used. He made sure every penny from the trust was accounted for and spent transparently. But more importantly, he talked to people. He listened to their concerns about the trust, acknowledged their fears about outsider control, and explained Jonas's vision as clearly as he could. He didn't try to win arguments or force anyone to support him. He just told the truth and trusted that people would recognize it when they heard it. Timothy was at the workshop every day, working alongside Silas with the devotion of a true apprentice. The boy had grown in confidence and skill over the months, and Silas had come to think of him almost as a son. One afternoon, as they worked on repairing a wagon wheel together, Timothy asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. "What's going to happen at the meeting, Mr. Silas?" "Hard to say," Silas replied, checking the alignment of the wheel. "People will talk, air their concerns, vote on whether they trust me to manage the trust properly. What if they vote no?" Silas considered that. "Then I guess I'll have to accept their decision and find another way to honor Jonas's memory." "That's not fair," Timothy said with the passionate certainty of youth. "You've done nothing but help people. Why would they turn against you now?" Edward Hastings was a serious man in his 60s, gray-haired and dignified, with the careful manner of someone who dealt in weighty matters. He began by reading the standard provisions. The ranch and most of the business holdings would be sold, with proceeds divided between Richard and Elizabeth. Personal items and family heirlooms would go to them as well. It was all very proper and expected. Then Hastings reached the section about the community trust. "To be established immediately upon my death," he read, "is the Jacob Crane and Jonas Whitmore Community Trust. To be funded with the sum of $200,000. There was a sharp intake of breath from Richard. $200,000 was a substantial fortune. Even by Jonas's standards, Hastings continued, "The trust shall be administered by 2 trustees, Edward Hastings, acting as legal advisor, and Silas Crane, acting as primary director. The funds shall be used to maintain and expand the community workshop, to establish educational programs, to provide assistance to families in need, and to generally serve the betterment of Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory. All decisions regarding the use of trust funds shall require agreement of both trustees." "This is absurd," Richard said, standing up. $200,000 handed over to, no offense, Mr. Crane, a virtual stranger. Father must have been out of his mind. "Your father was of completely sound mind when he made these arrangements," Hastings said calmly. "I witnessed the signing personally, and Doc Harrison provided medical certification of his mental competence specifically to prevent any such challenges." Elizabeth was staring at Silas with undisguised suspicion. "How long did you know our father, Mr. Crane?" "A few months," Silas said quietly. "But he knew my father 40 years ago. Jonas was honoring a debt he felt he owed. What debt could possibly justify this?" Richard demanded. Silas hesitated, then decided they deserved to know at least part of the truth. "My father saved his life during a blizzard in the winter of 1843. Jonas tried to repay him, but my father refused payment. He only asked that Jonas pass the kindness forward someday. The trust is Jonas keeping that promise." The siblings exchanged glances. "Do you have any proof of this?" Elizabeth asked. Silas pulled the photograph from his pocket and handed it to her. She studied it, then passed it to Richard, who looked at it with a furrowed brow. "This could be anyone," Richard said, though his tone was less certain now. "It's authenticated in my files," Hastings said, "along with Jonas's personal journal entries documenting his search for Jacob Crane's family and his reasons for establishing the trust. Everything is legally sound and properly documented. We'll contest this," Richard said, handing the photograph back to Silas. "It's clearly undue influence. This man manipulated our father when he was vulnerable." "That's your right," Hastings replied. "But I should inform you that contesting the will would be expensive and, in my professional opinion, futile. Your father anticipated this possibility and took extensive measures to ensure his wishes would be respected." Sheriff Brennan spoke up from where he'd been standing silently. "I knew Jonas Whitmore for 20 years. He was the shrewdest man I ever met. If he wanted Silas to have this responsibility, he had good reason. And I've watched Silas run that workshop for months now. He's done nothing but good for this community. We don't even live here," Elizabeth said, though her tone was more resigned than angry now. "We don't know these people or understand what Father was trying to do. Then maybe," Hastings suggested gently, "you should trust that your father knew what he was doing. He loved you both. He left you substantial inheritances. But he also loved this community, and he wanted to ensure its future was secured. Is that really so hard to accept?" The siblings left an hour later, unhappy but not actively hostile. They'd stopped short of threatening legal action, though Richard made it clear they'd be watching closely to ensure the trust funds were used appropriately. Silas couldn't blame them for their suspicion. From their perspective, he must have looked like an opportunist who'd taken advantage of their dying father. After they'd gone, Hastings turned to Silas. "That went better than I expected, actually. I thought they'd file papers immediately. Will they contest it eventually?" Silas asked. "Probably not," Hastings said. "Once they calm down and review the documentation, they'll realize it's airtight. Jonas was thorough, borderline obsessive about making sure this couldn't be challenged successfully." He paused, studying Silas with the same careful assessment he probably used in courtrooms. "He believed in you quite strongly, you know. Talked about you constantly in those last weeks. Said you reminded him of the man he'd been before he got caught up in accumulating wealth. I don't know if I'm up to this," Silas admitted. "Jonas thought you were," Hastings replied. "And in my experience, Jonas Whitmore was rarely wrong about people. But understand this, Mr. Crane, you'll face opposition. The trust represents a significant change in how this community operates, and change always creates resistance." "Clayton Mercer," Silas said, "among others. Mercer's already been making noise, suggesting the trust is illegal or immoral. He's calling for a town meeting to discuss it. He's also, and this is where it gets concerning, been talking to the territorial governor's office about investigating Jonas's affairs. He's claiming fraud and manipulation." Silas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Can he actually cause problems?" He can try, Hastings said, and with his connections and influence, he might succeed in forcing a formal hearing. If that happens, you'll need to testify. You'll need to defend Jonas's character and your own. It won't be pleasant. I'll do whatever's necessary, Silas said. Good. Hastings gathered his papers and stood. I'll begin the formal process of establishing the trust. In the meantime, keep running the workshop as you have been. Document everything, every dollar spent, every person helped, every class taught. If we end up in court, we'll need evidence that the trust is being used exactly as Jonas intended. That evening, Silas sat alone in the workshop after everyone had gone home. The space was quiet, just the creak of wood settling and the wind outside. He looked around at the benches, the tools, the projects in various stages of completion. This was Jonas's legacy, built on his father's kindness, sustained by trust between generations. He thought about Richard and Elizabeth's suspicion, about Mercer's threats, about the hearing that might be coming. Part of him wanted to walk away, to return to the mountains and the simple isolation he'd known before. But he'd made a promise to Jonas, and more than that, he'd made a promise to himself. He'd come back to life these past months, reconnected with purpose and community, and he couldn't retreat now. No matter how difficult things got, he pulled out the photograph one more time, looking at his young father standing beside young Jonas, two men whose choices 40 years ago had led to this moment. The circle had closed, but it wasn't finished. It would continue forward through him, through Timothy and the others learning at the workshop, through every person whose life was touched by the kindness that Jacob Crane had started and Jonas Whitmore had amplified. I won't let you down, Silas said quietly to the photograph, to the memories, to the legacy he now carried. Either of you. He locked up the workshop and rode home under a sky full of winter stars, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead, but finally believing he had the strength to face it. The town meeting was called for the first Saturday in December, to be held in the church, since it was the only building large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. Clayton Mercer had been busy in the 2 weeks since Jonas's funeral, spreading doubt and gathering supporters. His message was simple and effective. Jonas Whitmore had been manipulated in his final months by a stranger who now controlled a fortune meant for the community. Silas spent those 2 weeks preparing in his own way. He continued running the workshop, documenting everything as Hastings had advised. He kept careful records of who came in, what they learned, what materials were used. He made sure every penny from the trust was accounted for and spent transparently. But more importantly, he talked to people. He listened to their concerns about the trust, acknowledged their fears about outsider control, and explained Jonas's vision as clearly as he could. He didn't try to win arguments or force anyone to support him. He just told the truth and trusted that people would recognize it when they heard it. Timothy was at the workshop every day, working alongside Silas with the devotion of a true apprentice. The boy had grown in confidence and skill over the months, and Silas had come to think of him almost as a son. One afternoon, as they worked on repairing a wagon wheel together, Timothy asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. "What's going to happen at the meeting, Mr. Silas?" "Hard to say," Silas replied, checking the alignment of the wheel. "People will talk, air their concerns, vote on whether they trust me to manage the trust properly. What if they vote no?" Silas considered that. "Then I guess I'll have to accept their decision and find another way to honor Jonas's memory." "That's not fair," Timothy said with the passionate certainty of youth. "You've done nothing but help people. Why would they turn against you now?" "These are all touching stories," he said, standing again. "But they don't address the fundamental question. Should one man, any man, have unilateral control over such wealth? Even if we accept that Silas is honest, power corrupts. Today he might be honorable, but in a year, 5 years, 10, without oversight, without checks on his authority, who's to say the trust won't be misused?" It was a fair point, Silas had to admit, and he could see it resonating with people who wanted to trust him but feared the precedent. Hastings stood again, which is why the trust has built-in safeguards. "Silas cannot make major financial decisions without my agreement. An independent accounting firm will audit the trust annually, and the trust's charter requires public reporting of all expenditures over $100. These aren't just my promises. They're legally binding requirements Jonas built into the trust's foundation. He paused, then added, and if the community truly loses confidence in Silas's stewardship, there's a provision allowing for his removal by majority vote of a community board. Jonas wanted accountability, but he also wanted someone who understood his vision. Silas provides both. Reverend Price called for a vote. The question was simple. Should Silas Crane continue as trustee of the community trust, or should he step down pending investigation? Hands rose across the church. Silas didn't watch the count, couldn't bear to. He kept his eyes on the floor, breathing steadily, waiting. The vote is clear, Reverend Price announced. By a margin of approximately 3-1, this community supports Silas Crane's continued administration of the trust. Relief flooded through Silas. But he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, accepting the decision with the same quiet dignity he'd brought to everything else. Mercer stormed out, his supporters trailing behind him, but most people stayed. Many came forward to shake Silas's hand, to offer encouragement, to thank him for his honesty. As the crowd thinned, Martha approached him with tears in her eyes. "Sarah would be so proud of you," she said, hugging him briefly. "She always knew you had more to give the world than you thought you did." That night, alone in his cabin, Silas held his father's compass, the one Jonas had given him, the one Jacob had originally given to Jonas. It was tarnished and old, but the needle still pointed true north. That's what he needed to be, Silas thought. A compass for this community. Not perfect, not infallible, but true. Always pointing toward what was right, even when the path was difficult. He'd won this battle, but he knew it wasn't over. Mercer would continue opposing him, and there would be other challenges ahead. But tonight, he'd proven to himself and the community that he could stand up when it mattered, that Jacob's son could carry the legacy forward, that kindness, passed from generation to generation, was stronger than fear or greed or suspicion. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The territorial hearing was scheduled for late January, 2 months after the community meeting. Despite the town's vote of confidence, Clayton Mercer had made good on his threat to escalate the matter. He'd contacted the territorial governor's office, alleging financial impropriety and claiming that a formal investigation was needed to protect the public interest. The governor, facing pressure from Mercer's political connections, had agreed to a hearing. Edward Hastings had warned Silas that this would be different from the church meeting. "This is a legal proceeding," he'd said. "The judge will be looking at documents, questioning witnesses, examining every detail of the trust's establishment and operation. Mercer will have a lawyer, probably a good one, and they'll be trying to find any crack in our story, any irregularity they can exploit." Silas spent the intervening weeks preparing. He organized every receipt, every record, every piece of documentation related to the workshop. He worked with Hastings to prepare testimony, reviewing the timeline of events over and over until he could recite it in his sleep. And he continued running the workshop, determined to show through actions that the trust was being used exactly as Jonas had intended. The workshop guest register became crucial evidence. It was a simple leather-bound book where everyone who used the workshop signed their name and briefly noted what they'd worked on. Silas had started it on opening day, thinking it would be a nice record for Jonas to see. Now it was proof of the workshop's impact, page after page of names, representing families helped, skills learned, community members empowered. Timothy had taken to adding small notes beside some entries, describing what people had accomplished. John Hendricks fixed his plow, saved hiring a smith. Mrs. Cooper learned to repair harnesses, starting her own business now. Thomas Baker made a cradle for his new baby, first thing he ever built. These annotations in Timothy's careful handwriting told the human stories behind the signatures. The night before the hearing, Silas couldn't sleep. He sat at his cabin table with the register open before him, reading through the names and remembering faces. Over 200 people had used the workshop in just 4 months. 200 lives touched, families helped, skills passed on. It was a tangible record of Jonas's legacy, of Jacob's kindness echoing forward through time. He thought about what was at stake. If the judge ruled against him, the trust could be frozen, possibly dissolved. The workshop might have to close. All the momentum they'd built, all the hope they'd created could be lost. And beyond the practical concerns, there was something deeper. The question of whether kindness and trust could survive in a world that often valued suspicion and self-interest more highly. Silas closed the register and ran his hand over its worn leather cover. Whatever happened tomorrow, this book proved something important. It proved that Jonas's vision had worked, that people responded to genuine help. That community could be built on foundation of mutual support, rather than competition and fear. The morning was bitter cold, with frost covering everything in a delicate white coating. Silas dressed in his best clothes, still simple, still practical, but clean and presentable. He placed the compass in one pocket and the photograph in the other, talismans connecting him to the men whose legacy he carried. Then he rode down to Copper Ridge, where a wagon waited to take him and Hastings to Helena for the hearing. The territorial courthouse was an impressive building, built of stone and wood, with tall windows and a dignified presence that spoke of law and order. Silas felt out of place the moment he walked through the doors, surrounded by lawyers and clerks and officials who all seemed to know exactly what they were doing and where they belonged. The hearing room was smaller than he'd expected, more intimate. A raised bench dominated one end, where the judge would sit. Tables faced it on either side, one for Hastings and Silas, one for Mercer and his attorney. Behind them were seats for observers, and Silas was touched to see that Martha Hayes had made the journey, along with Sheriff Brennan, Timothy and his father, and several other townspeople who'd taken time away from their lives to support him. Clayton Mercer sat at the opposing table with a lawyer who looked expensive and confident. The lawyer was young, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested he enjoyed adversarial proceedings. His name was Gerald Blackwood, Hastings had told Silas, and he specialized in estate law and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman in her 50s named Judge Margaret Thornton. She had grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. Hastings had described her as fair but exacting, someone who cared more about evidence than emotion. "This hearing is called to order," Judge Thornton announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "We are here to examine allegations of impropriety regarding the establishment and administration of the Jonas Whitmore Community Trust. Mr. Blackwood, you represent the petitioner. Please present your opening argument." Blackwood stood, and Silas braced himself. The real battle was about to begin, and everything Jonas had worked for hung in the balance. Blackwood's opening was smooth and calculated. He painted a picture of an elderly man in declining health, isolated from his family, befriended by a stranger who quickly positioned himself to inherit a substantial fortune. He didn't accuse Silas directly of fraud, but he raised questions about the speed of the relationship's development, about Jonas's medical condition, about whether proper oversight had been maintained. "We're not here to impugn Mr. Crane's character," Blackwood said with false reasonableness. "We're here to ensure that a vulnerable man's estate was handled appropriately and that public funds are being properly administered. The people of Montana Territory deserve that assurance." Hastings responded with facts. He presented the timeline of Jonas's planning, showing that the trust had been conceived months before Silas entered the picture. He introduced medical testimony from Dr. Harrison, confirming Jonas's mental competence throughout. He detailed the legal safeguards built into the trust and presented financial records showing every penny accounted for. Jonas Whitmore was neither vulnerable nor confused, Hastings stated firmly. He was a shrewd businessman executing a carefully planned legacy. The only question here is whether we'll honor his clearly expressed wishes or allow baseless suspicion to override his autonomy. The real testimony began after lunch. Blackwood called his witnesses first, a banker who questioned the unusual nature of the trust's establishment, a business associate of Jonas's who claimed the old man had seemed distracted in his final months, and Clayton Mercer himself, who testified about his concerns regarding the workshop's impact on local business. Under cross-examination, Hastings systematically dismantled their credibility. The banker admitted he'd never actually reviewed the trust documents. The business associate acknowledged he hadn't seen Jonas in over a year. Mercer was forced to concede that his opposition was at least partly motivated by commercial competition. Then it was the defense's turn. Hastings called Sheriff Brennan first, who testified about Jonas's deliberate planning and Silas's consistent integrity. Martha Hayes spoke about the workshop's community impact and Silas's dedication to honoring Jonas's vision. Buck Henley, Jonas's ranch foreman, described his employer's enthusiasm for the project and his complete confidence in Silas. The afternoon's final witness was Timothy Morrison. The boy was nervous, his voice shaking at first, but he steadied as he spoke about what the workshop had meant to his family. Blackwood tried to dismiss his testimony as that of a child, but Judge Thornton cut him off. "The witness is describing his direct experience," she said sharply. "His age doesn't make that experience less valid." "Continue, young man." Timothy finished his testimony, and Silas felt a swell of pride. The boy had faced down an intimidating lawyer in a formal courtroom and held his ground. That was what Jonas's legacy was creating. Not just skills, but confidence and courage. The next morning, Silas took the stand. Blackwood began his cross-examination aggressively, questioning every aspect of Silas's relationship with Jonas. How long had they known each other? What did they discuss? When did Jonas first mention the trust? Wasn't it convenient that Silas appeared just when Jonas was most vulnerable? Silas answered each question calmly and honestly. He didn't embellish or defend. He simply told the truth about the wheelchair, about his initial reluctance, about learning of his father's connection to Jonas, about his growing friendship with the old man. "Mr. Crane," Blackwood said, leaning forward, "you expect us to believe that you had no idea who Jonas Whitmore was when you fixed his wheelchair?" "I knew the name," Silas replied. "Everyone in Copper Ridge knows the Whitmore name. But I didn't recognize him, and I didn't fix the chair because of who he was. I fixed it because it needed fixing." "How very convenient," Blackwood said with obvious sarcasm. "It's the truth," Silas said simply. Blackwood changed tactics, producing the photograph. "This image allegedly shows your father with Jonas Whitmore 40 years ago. But we only have your word for that. We only have Jonas's word, and he's conveniently dead and can't be questioned." Something cold settled in Silas's chest at the word "conveniently," but he kept his voice level. "My father saved Jonas's life in the winter of 1843. Jonas spent 40 years trying to repay that debt. The trust is how he chose to do it. That's not convenient." "That's a man keeping a promise," Judge Thornton intervened. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have evidence contradicting Mr. Crane's testimony?" "I have questions about its plausibility, Your Honor." "Questions are not evidence," the judge said. "Move on." Blackwood tried a few more angles, but Silas's simple, consistent honesty left little room for attack. When Hastings had his turn, he asked just one question. "Mr. Crane, why did you accept this responsibility?" Silas thought about that, then answered from his heart. "Because Jonas trusted me, and because my father taught me that when someone offers you a chance to do good in the world, you don't turn it down just because it's hard or scary. The trust isn't about me. It's about continuing a chain of kindness that started 40 years ago and hopefully will continue long after I'm gone." The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Blackwood emphasized doubt and the need for caution. Hastings emphasized evidence and the importance of honoring Jonas's clearly expressed wishes. Then they waited while Judge Thornton reviewed the materials one final time. When she returned to the bench, her expression was unreadable. "I've reviewed the evidence presented," she said. And I'm prepared to rule." The courtroom went silent. Silas felt Martha's hand briefly touch his shoulder from behind, a gesture of support. He took a slow breath and waited for the words that would determine everything. Judge Thornton looked directly at him, and for just a moment, he thought he saw the hint of approval in her stern eyes. "The petition to invalidate the trust is denied," she announced. "The evidence overwhelmingly supports that Jonas Whitmore was of sound mind, that the trust was properly established, and that it is being administered in accordance with his stated intentions. Furthermore, I find that Mr. Crane has demonstrated both competence and integrity in his role as trustee. This hearing is concluded." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like a door closing on doubt and opening on possibility. Silas sat very still for a moment, letting it sink in. They'd won. Jonas's legacy was secure. The work could continue. Around him he heard quiet celebration, Martha's tearful "thank God," Timothy's excited whisper, Sheriff Brennan's satisfied grunt. But Silas just closed his eyes and sent a silent thank you to two men he'd never see again, but whose presence he felt as surely as he felt the compass in his pocket. The kindness had survived. The circle would continue, and that was all that mattered. Spring came to Copper Ridge with a gentleness that felt like a reward after the hard winter. The snow melted from the valley floor, revealing new grass and wild flowers. The streams ran full and clear with meltwater, and the aspens budded with fresh green leaves. It was a season of renewal, and it mirrored the changes happening in the town itself. The workshop had become the heart of the community in the 6 months since the hearing. More people came every week, not just to learn skills, but to connect with neighbors, to share knowledge, to build something larger than themselves. The space had evolved beyond its original purpose. On Tuesday evenings, women gathered for a quilting circle that Martha had organized. Thursday afternoons, older folks came to share stories and traditional skills with younger generations. Saturday mornings, children worked on projects under Timothy's increasingly confident supervision. Timothy had grown in more ways than just skill. At 13 now, he stood taller and spoke with more confidence. He'd become Silas's apprentice in every sense, working at the workshop 4 days a week and learning not just carpentry, but leadership. Silas had started paying him a small wage from the trust, and the boy sent most of it home to help his family. The Morrisons had held onto their farm, supplementing their income with repair work Mr. Morrison did from the workshop. And they spoke often about how the trust had saved their livelihood. The trust had expanded its programs too. Using the interest from Jonas's investment, they'd started a lending library, established a small scholarship fund for promising students, and created a tool-sharing cooperative that allowed farmers to access expensive equipment they couldn't afford individually. Each program was managed carefully, with Edward Hastings maintaining strict financial oversight and Silas ensuring everything aligned with Jonas's vision of practical community support. Clayton Mercer had left Copper Ridge in February. Shortly after the hearing, his business had declined to the point where he could no longer sustain it, and he'd sold out to a merchant from Helena. The new owner was cooperative rather than competitive, seeing the workshop as complementary to his business rather than a threat. It wasn't that Silas had won. It was that the community had chosen a different path, one based on collaboration rather than competition. On a bright Saturday morning in early May, Silas stood outside the workshop, watching people arrive for the day. He saw families, individuals, young and old, all coming together in a space that had become more than just a building. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over isolation, generosity over greed. Martha walked up beside him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She offered him one, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. "You've done something remarkable here," she said finally. "Jonas would be proud. Sarah would be proud." "Jonas did it," Silas replied. "And my father before him. I'm just the one who happened to be standing in the right place when the legacy needed passing forward." "That's not true, and you know it," Martha said gently. You could have walked away a dozen times. You could have let fear or grief keep you hidden in those mountains. Instead, you chose to honor their memory by living it. That takes courage, Silas. He thought about that as he sipped his coffee. He'd been back to his cabin less and less over the winter, finding himself drawn to town more often, pulled by the connections he'd rebuilt and the purpose he'd rediscovered. The solitude he'd thought he needed had transformed into something else. Not abandonment of his private self, but integration of it with the community. He could still retreat to the mountains when he needed to, but he no longer needed to hide there. The sign above the workshop entrance read, "The Jacob Crane and Jonas Whitmore Community Center," in bold letters that Timothy had painted himself. It was a good name, one that honored both men and made clear what the place represented. Silas had added a plaque below it, bearing the inscription Jonas had shown him from his pocket watch. "Time is precious. Use it well." It served as a reminder to everyone who entered that their moments mattered, that what they did with their lives created ripples they might never see, but that would touch others long after they were gone. Later that afternoon, Silas rode up to the cemetery on the hill. He'd made this trip regularly since the hearing, finding comfort in the quiet conversations he had with the 3 people buried there. He brought fresh wildflowers, purple lupine, and yellow balsam root, the same flowers that grew on his father's grave. He placed flowers on each grave, then sat down between his father and Sarah, looking out over the valley. The workshop was visible from here, a small building in the distance, but significant in meaning. "I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me," he said, addressing both his father and his wife. "It's not about being perfect or fearless. It's about showing up anyway. It's about seeing what needs doing and doing it, even when you're scared or sad or uncertain. That's what Pa taught Jonas. That's what Jonas taught me. And that's what I'm trying to pass on to Timothy and all the others." He pulled out the photograph, now carried safely in a leather case to protect it from wear. He looked at the 2 young men, frozen in that moment of connection that had rippled forward through decades. "The circle's complete," he said quietly. "But it's not closed. It keeps going, keeps expanding, touching new lives in ways you never imagined. That's the real legacy, not what we leave behind, but what we set in motion." A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. Silas watched it for a moment, then stood and prepared to head back down to town. He had work to do. Timothy was waiting to learn a new joinery technique, and several families needed help with spring repairs. But before he left, he placed his hand on Sarah's headstone, then his father's. "Thank you," he said, "for teaching me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a different chapter, one where loss transforms into purpose and isolation gives way to connection." He mounted Dancer and rode back toward Copper Ridge, toward the community that had become his again, toward the work that had become his calling. The mountains rose behind him, solid and eternal, but he was no longer running toward them for escape. He was riding between them and the town, balanced between solitude and connection, between past and future, between grief and renewal. The workshop came into view, its windows bright with afternoon sun, smoke rising from the chimney, people moving in and out with purpose and hope. This was Jonas's legacy and Jacob's, and now it was Silas's to nurture and pass forward when his own time came. But that time wasn't now. Now was for living, for teaching, for continuing the work of kindness that had begun with a young man helping another survive a blizzard 42 years ago. Now was for honoring the past by building the future, one small act at a time. Silas urged Dancer into a gentle trot, riding toward the workshop, toward the community, toward the life he'd found again after years of searching in all the wrong places. He discovered what his father and Jonas had both known, that the greatest wealth isn't measured in gold or land, but in lives touched, skills shared, and kindness passed forward through generations. The sun was warm on his shoulders, and ahead of him, Timothy stood in the workshop doorway, waving. Silas raised his hand in return, a simple gesture of connection that said everything that mattered. He was home, not in the cabin in the mountains, but here, among people who needed him and whom he needed in return. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest acts create the biggest ripples. You fix a wheelchair for a stranger, and it changes everything. You show kindness without expecting anything back, and it echoes through time. You honor the people you've lost by continuing to live the values they taught you. That was the real story. Not about wealth or recognition or grand gestures, but about ordinary people choosing every day to help one another. Choosing connection over isolation, choosing generosity over greed, choosing love over fear. It was a story worth telling. It was a story worth living. And as Silas dismounted and walked into the workshop to join the work of the day, he knew it was a story that would continue long after he was gone, rippling forward into a future he could barely imagine but had helped to create. That was enough. That was everything.